I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father. These desperate words, spoken through a blizzard by an alien widow, would shatter the isolation of one broken soldier forever. This HFY story has become the most requested tale in our sci-fi stories collection, breaking every record for emotional impact and proving why human compassion transcends all species barriers. But who was this mysterious alien widow? What drove her to traverse the frozen wasteland of Nevada 13 with 2 dying children? And why did she choose the one human who had sworn never to let anyone close again, on the ice planet, Nevada 13, where temperatures drop to minus 60 degrees and survival means absolute solitude? Former Major Marcus Kane thought he'd found the perfect place to disappear, until 3 frozen figures appeared at his door during the worst storm in decades. This isn't just another space story or Reddit story, it's a movement. Millions have discovered that the best bedtime stories and audio stories aren't about conquest, but about the quiet moments when broken souls choose to heal together. Welcome to the human stories that prove love knows no boundaries. Some doors should never be opened. Some knocks should never be answered. But on Nevada 13, mercy has a way of finding you in the most unexpected forms, turning the best HFY stories into something deeper than mere human triumph. They become tales of human connection that transcend species and circumstance. The wind didn't whisper on Nevada 13. It screamed. It clawed at the reinforced walls of the abandoned military outpost with fingers of ice rattling the solar panels and sending frost spiraling down the heating vents like ghostly smoke. The storm had been building for 3 days now, transforming the already desolate landscape into a white void where even the hardiest of space stories would struggle to find hope. Temperature readings flickered at minus 47 degrees Celsius and dropping. Marcus Kane sat hunched over his morning ration, a cup of synthetic coffee growing cold between his calloused hands. Steam rose from the liquid in thin wisps, the only movement in the oppressive stillness of his self-imposed prison. The heating core hummed its familiar song, part lullaby, part death rattle, the only sound that had kept him company for the past 3 years. 3 years since he'd chosen exile over explanation. 3 years since he'd decided that the frozen wasteland of Nevada 13 was preferable to facing another living soul. At 42, Marcus Kane looked older than his years. The jagged scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth told one story. His prematurely gray hair told another. But it was his eyes, pale blue and empty as the ice plains outside, that revealed the truth. He was a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and decided that feeling nothing was safer than risking everything again. Former Major of the Earth Defense Corps, survivor of the Proxima Centauri battle, and now, nothing. Just another broken soldier hiding at the edge of known space, listening to alien stories on the radio and pretending he didn't miss human contact. The outpost had been abandoned after the Galactic War ended, deemed too remote and resource-heavy to maintain. Perfect for a man who wanted to disappear. The previous inhabitants had left behind enough supplies to last a decade if rationed carefully, along with a functional heating system, basic medical equipment, and a communication array that Marcus had deliberately sabotaged 2 years ago. No messages in, no messages out. Just the way he preferred it. His daily routine had become as rigid as the ice outside. Wake at 0600. Check system diagnostics. Maintain equipment. Exercise. Eat. Read old military manuals until his eyes burned. Sleep when exhaustion finally overcame the nightmares. Repeat. It was a routine designed to keep his mind occupied, his hands busy, and his heart carefully sealed away from anything that might resemble hope or happiness. The kind of human stories that ended not in triumph but in successful isolation. But today felt different. The storm outside had taken on a more personal quality, as if Nevada 13 itself was trying to tell him something. Marcus, push the thought away. 3 years of solitude had taught him to recognize the early signs of cabin fever, and anthropomorphizing weather patterns was definitely one of them. Still, he found himself glancing toward the reinforced door more often than usual, listening for sounds that couldn't possibly be there. He finished his coffee and moved to the bank of monitors that showed the external feeds. Static filled most of the screens. The storm was interfering with the cameras again, but what he could see was a wall of white so complete it seemed to erase the very concept of outside. The wind speed indicator showed gusts approaching 70 kilometers per hour. Nothing could survive out there. Nothing would be stupid enough to try. As evening approached, Marcus went through his security checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Heating core functional but straining. Power grid stable but fluctuating. Communication array still deliberately offline. Emergency supplies adequate for another 18 months if carefully managed. It was the kind of methodical assessment that had kept him alive through 3 wars and countless hostile environments, but tonight it felt more like a ritual to ward off the growing unease in his chest. He paused at the weapons locker, his hand hovering over the plasma rifle he hadn't touched in months. The weight of it used to comfort him, the familiar grip a reminder of his training, his purpose, his identity. Now it just felt heavy. Marcus selected a smaller sidearm instead, checking the charge out of habit rather than necessity. On Nevada 13, the only enemies were the cold, the isolation, and the memories that stalked him through the long polar nights. The photo found him as he was sealing the locker. It always did. Tucked between maintenance schedules and emergency protocols, the image showed 4 people in Earth Defense Corps uniforms, young and confident, and absolutely certain they were going to save the galaxy. Marcus recognized the man on the left, younger, unscarred, holding his weapon like it weighed nothing instead of everything. The other 3 were gone now. Sarah Chen vaporized in the first wave of the Proxima assault. David Rodriguez, whose last words had been a joke about the terrible coffee in the med bay, and Lieutenant Emma Walsh, who had died in Marcus's arms while he whispered lies about reinforcements that were never coming. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle across his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had survived when they hadn't. He had made the decisions that led them into that hellscape, and he was the only one who came home to explain to families why their children, parents, siblings, lovers would never walk through their doors again. The kind of human stories that Reddit stories and science fiction stories rarely told, the ones where survival felt more like punishment than victory. A sound cut through his spiraling thoughts. Sharp, metallic, brief. Marcus's head snapped up, his hand automatically moving to his sidearm. The sound came again, a dull thudding against the main entrance, barely audible over the storm's fury. His mind immediately began running through possibilities: windborne debris, structural stress equipment malfunction. On Nevada 13, there were 100 explanations for unusual sounds, and exactly 0 of them involved visitors. He moved toward the door with practiced silence, every sense alert despite 3 years of rust. The thudding came again, and this time Marcus was close enough to distinguish its rhythm. Deliberate, purposeful, desperate. Someone was knocking. Marcus froze, his rational mind warring with impossibility. No ships had landed. His sensors would have detected them hours away. No rescue beacons had been activated. He'd made sure of that. No one knew he was here. And even if they did, no one would be insane enough to venture out in this storm. He was hallucinating, had to be. 3 years of isolation were finally taking their toll, manifesting phantom visitors to break the monotony of his self-imposed exile. The knocking came again, weaker now, but unmistakably real. 3 sharp raps followed by a longer pause, then 3 more. The universal signal for distress beaten out against his door by hands he couldn't see, seeking shelter from a storm that should have killed anything caught in its embrace. Marcus's training kicked in despite his disbelief. Threat assessment, protocol evaluation, risk management. His hand found the door controls while his mind ran through scenarios each more unlikely than the last. Smugglers, pirates, refugees, ghosts. None of it mattered. Protocol demanded investigation, and 3 years hadn't been enough to kill the soldier inside him entirely. He cracked the door open just wide enough to peer through the gap, and his breath caught in his throat. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the storm, barely visible through the swirling snow. A woman, tall, thin, swaying on her feet, stood protectively in front of 2 smaller shapes that clung to her legs like lifelines. They were alien, that much was immediately obvious. But beyond that, Marcus's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Blue-tinged skin that seemed to glow faintly in the storm's reflected light. Silver hair whipping in the wind like liquid metal. Eyes that caught and held the light from his doorway with an inner fire that spoke of intelligence, desperation, and something else, something that made Marcus's carefully constructed walls begin to crack. The woman's lips moved, forming words that the storm devoured before they could reach him. But her eyes, golden amber, shot through with veins of deeper brown locked onto his with an intensity that transcended language. She was asking for something. Pleading. The smaller figures pressed closer to her, and Marcus caught a glimpse of tiny faces, exhausted and blue, with cold, looking up at him with the kind of trust that children reserve for adults they believe might save them. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, Marcus Kane stood frozen between his past and his future, between the safety of isolation and the terrifying possibility of connection. The storm raged around the trio at his door, but something in the woman's eyes burned brighter than the cold, warmer than his carefully maintained distance. Then she spoke again, and this time, the wind carried her words directly to his heart. "I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father." The words hit him like a physical blow, stripping away 3 years of carefully constructed defenses in an instant. Not seduction, desperation. Not proposition plea. The raw honesty of it, the desperate vulnerability, the sheer courage it must have taken to offer herself to a stranger for the sake of 2 small lives clinging to her legs. It was the kind of moment that transformed Reddit stories into human stories, space stories into something universal and heartbreaking and absolutely real. Marcus Kane had spent 3 years believing he was done with saving people. 3 years convinced that his capacity for heroism had died with his squad on Proxima Centauri. But as he stared into the amber eyes of an alien widow offering everything she had for her children's survival, he felt something crack open inside his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The storm howled. The figures swayed. And somewhere in the distance, between one heartbeat and the next, the best bedtime stories and audio stories ever told began to unfold in real time, proving once again that the greatest science fiction stories are the ones that remind us what it truly means to be human. Time stopped. The storm raged on, wind howling like a living thing, snow whipping sideways with enough force to strip flesh from bone. But in the narrow gap between Marcus Kane's door and the frozen wasteland beyond, everything held its breath. The 3 figures swayed on their feet, blue-tinged faces turned toward him with an expression of desperate hope that cut through 3 years of carefully constructed isolation like a thermal blade through ice. This was the moment when even the best HFY stories pause, when human nature confronts its deepest test, the choice between safety and compassion. Marcus's hand remained frozen on his sidearm, muscle memory warring with disbelief. His mind cataloged details with military precision even as his heart hammered against his ribs. The woman, Zara, though he didn't know her name yet, stood perhaps 5'8" in human measurements, her pale blue skin almost luminescent against the storm's gray fury. Silver hair whipped around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the gaunt hollows of starvation and the desperate calculation in her amber eyes. She was alien, undeniably so, but the protective stance she maintained over the 2 small figures clinging to her legs was universally recognizable, maternal, fierce, and absolutely uncompromising. The children, for that's what they had to be, despite their otherworldly appearance pressed against their mother's legs like small refugees from some cosmic catastrophe. The girl, no more than 4 by human standards, had enormous eyes that seemed to hold too much wisdom for such a young face. Her brother, perhaps 6, tried to stand straighter despite the obvious exhaustion that made his small frame tremble. Both were barefoot, their feet a disturbing shade of purple that Marcus recognized from his military medical training. Frostbite. Advanced stages. Without immediate treatment, they would lose toes, possibly feet. Without shelter, they would lose everything. The threshold between warmth and death had never felt so literal. Behind Marcus lay the regulated atmosphere of his outpost, heating cores humming their steady song of survival emergency supplies, carefully rationed but adequate. Beyond his door stretched the kind of cold that killed with casual indifference, the sort of environmental hostility that turned even experienced space stories into cautionary tales about the universe's complete disregard for individual survival. The temperature readings on his door display showed minus 51 degrees Celsius and still dropping. Nothing should be alive out there. Nothing could survive more than minutes in such conditions. Yet here they stood, 3 impossible visitors who had somehow traversed the frozen hell of Nevada 13 to find his door. The statistical improbability of it made Marcus's logical mind reel. How had they known about his outpost? How had they navigated through a storm that had reduced visibility to 0? How had they survived long enough to reach him? These were the kind of questions that turned Reddit stories into legend, the sort of miraculous encounters that elevated science fiction stories beyond mere entertainment into something approaching the sacred. Please. The word cut through the storm's fury, spoken in accented but clear standard Galactic. Zara's voice carried the weight of absolute desperation, the tone of someone who had exhausted every other option and now stood at the precipice of her last hope. "We cannot. My children cannot." She swayed, and Marcus realized she was fighting to remain conscious, probably had been for hours. The effort it must have taken to keep moving, to keep her children moving, to navigate by whatever means had brought them here, it spoke to a strength that transcended species boundaries. The smaller child, the girl, made a sound that was half whimper, half sob, and something inside Marcus's chest cracked like ice under pressure. He had heard that sound before in field hospitals and refugee camps in the aftermath of battles when the counting began, and the numbers never added up right. It was the sound of a child who had been brave for too long, who had trusted the adults to make everything better, and was starting to understand that sometimes adults were just as lost and scared as everyone else. "Mama," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I can't feel my feet." That was when Marcus noticed the trail they had left behind them. Not footprints in the snow, which the wind would have erased within minutes, but drops of something dark that the cold had turned to crimson ice almost instantly. Blood. They had been walking on frozen, probably broken feet for who knew how long, leaving a breadcrumb trail of pain across the most hostile environment in this sector of space. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow, stripping away the last of his hesitation. Military training kicked in, overriding 3 years of deliberate isolation. Threat assessment minimal. Whatever else these beings were, they posed no immediate danger. Environmental factors. Critical exposure would kill them within minutes. Mission parameters clear. Save lives first, ask questions later. It was the same protocol that had guided him through a dozen combat zones. The same instinctive response that had made him a good soldier before it made him a broken one. But this wasn't about protocol. This was about the look in Zara's eyes as she spoke those words that would haunt him forever. "I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father." There was no seduction in it, no manipulation. Just the raw honesty of someone offering the only thing she had left in trade for her children's lives. The desperation of it, the courage it must have taken to make such an offer to a complete stranger, the sheer maternal ferocity that would drive someone to such lengths, it transformed what could have been a simple rescue into something that felt like destiny. Marcus had read enough human stories during his exile to recognize the archetype. The desperate stranger at the door, the choice between isolation and connection, the moment when ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. But this wasn't a story. This was 3 lives hanging in the balance while he stood frozen by his own fears and failures, letting protocol war with humanity in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The girl. Kira, though he wouldn't learn her name for hours yet, chose that moment to collapse. She simply folded like a puppet with cut strings, her small body crumpling onto the snow with the terrible finality of complete exhaustion. Zara cried out, dropping to her knees beside her daughter, her own condition forgotten in the face of maternal terror. The boy Jax reached for his sister with hands that shook from more than cold, and Marcus saw in his young face the same expression he had worn during the worst moments of the Proxima Centauri battle, the look of someone watching the people they love slip away and being powerless to stop it. That was the moment Marcus Kane stopped being an exile and remembered how to be human. Get inside. Now. The words came out harsher than he intended, military authority cutting through the storm's chaos like a blade. He stepped back, pulling the door wide, letting the warmth of his sanctuary spill out into the frozen waste. Bring her, quickly! Zara scooped up her daughter with the desperate efficiency of practiced emergency Jax clinging to her side as they stumbled across the threshold. Marcus slammed the door behind them, sealing out the storm and sealing in a moment that would change everything. The silence that followed felt deafening after hours of wind howl, broken only by the soft sound of snow melting from their clothes and the shallow breathing of 3 beings who had just been pulled back from the edge of death. In the warm yellow light of his outpost, Marcus got his first clear look at his unexpected guests. Zara knelt on his metal floor, cradling Kira against her chest, her silver hair now plastered against her skull with melted snow and exhaustion. Her skin had the translucent quality of certain deep space species, but there was nothing ethereal about the very real terror in her eyes as she watched her daughter's face for signs of consciousness. Jax stood beside them, trying to look brave despite the way his whole body shook, despite the blue tinge to his lips that spoke of how close they had all come to dying out there. They were Etherians, Marcus realized, recognizing the species from intelligence briefings during the war. Peaceful traders neutral in the galactic conflicts that had torn apart so many systems. Their homeworld was 3 sectors away, an impossible distance to have traveled in anything less than a full-equipped starship. Yet, here they were, refugees from something bad enough to drive them across the galaxy to seek shelter on one of the most hostile worlds in known space. Medical kit? Marcus muttered to himself, falling back on procedure because it was easier than processing the emotional magnitude of what he had just committed to. He moved to his emergency supplies, pulling out warming blankets and basic medical supplies while his mind raced through treatment protocols for hypothermia and frostbite. The girl needed immediate attention. Her breathing was too shallow, her skin temperature too low. But it was treatable. They were all treatable if he acted quickly enough. As he knelt beside them with the medical scanner, Zara looked up at him with those impossible amber eyes and whispered, "Thank you." 2 simple words that carried the weight of 3 lives of hope snatched back from the edge of extinction of trust, placed in a stranger's hands, because there was nowhere else left to turn. Marcus focused on the medical readings on temperature regulation and circulation checks on the familiar rhythm of emergency treatment that had kept him grounded through the worst moments of his military service. But underneath the professional calm, something was changing. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart were developing cracks, letting in the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with heating cores and everything to do with the fundamental human need to matter, to help, to be more than just another ghost haunting an empty outpost at the edge of space. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Nevada 13, but inside, something that felt dangerously like hope was beginning to thaw. As Marcus worked to save 3 lives he had never expected to encounter, he couldn't shake the feeling that they might be saving him right back. The best alien stories and short stories often hinged on such moments when survival became connection, when strangers became family, when the greatest space stories revealed themselves to be human stories in disguise. Sometimes salvation comes in forms we never expect. Sometimes the greatest audio stories and bedtime stories begin with someone knocking at your door in the middle of a storm. And sometimes 3 frozen refugees carry with them the power to transform even the most broken of soldiers into something resembling whole. Dawn on Nevada 13 didn't announce itself with sunrise. There was no sun strong enough to penetrate the perpetual storm clouds that shrouded the frozen world. Instead, morning arrived as a gradual lightening of the gray, a subtle shift from black ice to pewter sky that filtered through the frost-etched windows of Marcus Kane's outpost like weak tea through cheesecloth. It was in this pale, uncertain light that Marcus first witnessed something he hadn't seen in 3 years, the peaceful sleep of people who trusted him enough to let down their guard. Zara lay curled on the emergency cot he'd hastily assembled, her silver hair spread across the standard-issue pillow like liquid mercury caught in moonlight. The harsh lines of exhaustion and desperation that had marked her face during the storm had softened in sleep, revealing the elegant bone structure beneath. Her breathing was deep and even now, no longer the shallow gasps of hypothermia, and the blue tinge had faded from her skin to be replaced by a healthier, pale luminescence that seemed to come from within. Even in sleep, one arm remained protectively curved around her daughter. Kira, 4 years old by human standards, but carrying herself with the quiet dignity that seemed endemic to her species, had recovered, with the resilience that only children possessed. Her small chest rose and fell in the rhythm of deep, healing sleep. Her enormous amber eyes finally closed after watching him with that unnerving combination of trust and wariness for hours after their rescue. The medical scanner had confirmed what Marcus suspected: mild hypothermia, early-stage frostbite on her extremities, dehydration, and malnutrition. Treatable, all of it given time and care. Jax presented a more complex picture. At 6, he was old enough to understand the magnitude of what they had survived, young enough to still be processing the trauma of whatever had driven them to flee across the galaxy. He slept fitfully, one hand clutched around a piece of scrap metal Marcus had given him to examine the universal gesture of a child seeking comfort in the familiar weight of a tool or toy. His feet, wrapped in improvised bandages, showed the worst damage from their journey across the ice. It would be weeks before he could walk without pain, possibly longer before the nerve damage fully healed. Marcus found himself studying them with the intensity he had once reserved for tactical assessments, but this felt different, softer, more personal. For 3 years, the only faces he'd seen were those in old photographs, frozen memories of people who existed now only in his guilt and nightmares. These 3 breathing, healing beings represented something he'd convinced himself he no longer deserved the opportunity to matter to someone else's survival in a positive way. The outpost felt different too. What had been a sterile military environment, all sharp angles and utilitarian surfaces, now hummed with the subtle energy of habitation. Children's clothes hung drying near the heating vents. Medical supplies lay scattered across his formerly pristine workbench. The smell of synthetic soup still lingered in the air from the meal he'd prepared hours earlier, fighting his instinct to stick to regulation rations in favor of something that might appeal to alien palates and traumatize digestive systems. It was the kind of transformation that made the best HFY stories resonate across species lines. The recognition that home isn't built from walls and heating systems, but from the presence of people who need you and whom you in turn need right back. The sci-fi stories that endured weren't about technology or space battles. They were human stories wearing the costume of alien encounters, exploring what it meant to choose connection over isolation, responsibility over safety. You didn't sleep. Zara's voice, soft, with the particular hoarseness that followed exhaustion, cut through his contemplation. She had awakened without moving, without changing her position, but her amber eyes were now open and fixed on him with that same unnerving directness he'd noticed during the storm. Marcus realized he was still sitting in the same chair he'd occupied all night, ostensibly monitoring their condition, but really just watching, protecting, standing guard over something precious in a way he hadn't done since his last deployment. Couldn't, he admitted, which was more honesty than he'd offered anyone in years. Wanted to make sure you were stable. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Kira, and Marcus noticed how her movements carried a fluid grace despite the obvious exhaustion. Etherians, he recalled from his intelligence briefings, had evolved on a world with slightly lower gravity than Earth standard. Here on Nevada 13, they would feel heavier, more constrained by their own weight. Yet another disadvantage they'd overcome to reach his door. The children, she said, her accent lending a musical quality to the standard Galactic that made even simple words sound like poetry. Are they recovering? Kira's vitals are good. Kids bounce back fast from hypothermia if you catch it early. Jack's will need more time. The frostbite damage to his feet was more extensive, but I've seen worse. He'll walk again, probably without permanent impairment. Marcus found himself slipping into the clinical tone he'd used in field hospitals when delivering medical assessments to worried family members. It felt natural, reassuring. They're both stronger than they look. They had to be. Zara's voice carried a weight of meaning that spoke to journeys both literal and metaphorical. After their father died, strength became survival. For all of us. It was the first concrete detail she'd offered about their circumstances, and Marcus found himself leaning forward despite his intention to maintain professional distance. Reddit stories and alien stories were full of refugees with mysterious pasts. But this was real. 3 lives shaped by loss and desperation seeking shelter in the last place anyone would think to look. The war. He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Galactic War had touched every system, every species, leaving a wake of displaced families and broken worlds that would take generations to fully catalog. Indirectly. Zara's gaze drifted to her children, and Marcus saw her face tighten with the particular pain of a parent forced to explain grown-up horrors to young minds. Darian, my mate, was a trader strictly neutral, but neutrality meant nothing when the supply lines collapsed. Pirates, desperate military units, survivors with no other options. Everyone took what they needed from anyone weaker. Marcus nodded, recognizing the pattern. He'd seen it on a dozen worlds during his service, the secondary casualties of conflict, the ripple effects that destroyed lives years after the actual fighting ended. He tried to defend a shipment. He tried to defend us. The simple statement carried the weight of absolute truth. We were aboard his vessel when the raiders came. He bought us time to reach the escape pods, but... She gestured vaguely, encompassing loss too vast for words. Etherian's mate for life, Major Kane. When Darian died, part of me died with him. In our culture, that makes me incomplete, unworthy of protection or consideration. The casual brutality of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd encountered dozens of alien cultures during his military service, but the capacity for societies to create their own victims never failed to surprise him. So you ran. We survived. There was steel beneath the musical accent, now iron wrapped in silk. But survival for a widow with children, especially one marked as incomplete. The options were limited, and the men who offered protection usually wanted more than I was willing to give. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, a familiar rage that had nothing to do with his own trauma and everything to do with the fundamental injustice of adults who would exploit desperation. It was the same anger that had driven him through the worst battles of the war, the fury that came from witnessing unnecessary cruelty. They hurt you. It wasn't a question, and Zara didn't treat it as one. They tried. We left before they could succeed, but... She pulled back the sleeve of her torn garment, revealing faded bruises along her forearm and the distinctive pattern of grip marks. Running becomes harder each time. Nevada 13 was supposed to be temporary shelter while we figured out our next move. Then the storm hit, and your outpost was the only structure showing on our emergency scanners. Lucky for all of us. Marcus meant it. Whatever confluence of circumstances had brought them to his door, he was beginning to realize the rescue had been mutual. "What's your plan now?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Plan..." The storm's passed. Weather should be stable for the next few days, maybe a week if we're lucky. If you need transport off-world, I can jury-rig the communication array, send a distress signal. Someone will respond eventually. Even as he said it, Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a reluctance he didn't want to examine too closely. Zara studied his face with that unnerving directness, as if reading thoughts he hadn't yet formed. And if we don't want to leave? The question hung between them like a challenge. Marcus found himself thinking of the past 12 hours, the purposeful activity of medical care, the satisfaction of solving problems that didn't involve military strategy or body counts, the simple pleasure of preparing food for people who needed it. For the first time in 3 years, he'd felt useful rather than merely functional. Resources are limited, he heard himself say, though his heart wasn't in the practical objection. Food, medical supplies, life support systems. This place was designed for one person in emergency conditions, not a family for extended habitation. But it's possible. There was something in her voice, hope maybe, or the desperate calculation of someone with limited options. We wouldn't be a burden. I have technical skills, medical training from my time as Darian's partner. Jax is remarkably good with mechanical systems for his age. Even Kira can contribute. She has an intuitive understanding of life support systems that's unusual for her species. Marcus felt the last of his resistance crumbling, though he wasn't sure when he'd started resisting in the first place. Why would you want to stay? This isn't exactly prime real estate. No civilization for 3 sectors, no amenities, winters that last 8 months out of every year. It's safe. The simple statement carried enormous weight. No one will look for us here. No one will try to use us. We can heal, learn, maybe even find some measure of peace. She paused, studying his scarred face with those impossible amber eyes. And perhaps you need us as much as we need you. The observation hit closer to home than Marcus was comfortable admitting. "I'm not good with people anymore," he said quietly. 3 years alone, and before that, I lost people, good people, because of decisions I made. The war, Proxima Centauri. I was in command of a strike team, 37 of the best soldiers in the Earth Defense Corps. We walked into what should have been a routine mop-up operation and found ourselves facing 10 times the expected resistance. I had to choose between pulling back and leaving civilians to die, or pushing forward and risking my people. Marcus felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the crushing certainty of command decisions that had no right answers. I chose to push forward. 34 of my people didn't come home. Zara absorbed this in silence, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. And the civilians, we saved them. All of them. Evacuated an entire colony before the enemy could regroup. Marcus laughed bitterly. Military success by any measure. I received commendations, medals, recommendations for promotion. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the people who died because I couldn't find a better way. So you came here to punish yourself. The blunt assessment stung because it was accurate. I came here to make sure I never had to make those kinds of decisions again. And yet, Zara said softly, last night you made the decision to save us. Does that feel like a mistake? Marcus looked at the sleeping children, at Kira's peaceful face, and Jax's restless slumber at the way they had both trusted him completely within hours of their first meeting. "No," he admitted. "It doesn't feel like a mistake. Then perhaps you're healing too." Before Marcus could respond to that observation, Kira stirred and sat up, blinking enormous amber eyes in the gray morning light. She looked around the outpost with the frank curiosity of childhood, taking in the military efficiency and alien technology with equal interest. "Good morning, little star," Zara said, in what Marcus assumed was their native language, her voice taking on the particular warmth reserved for children. Kira responded in the same musical tongue, then switched to heavily accented standard Galactic. "Are we safe, Mama?" "Yes, darling, we're safe. Is the kind man going to let us stay?" The question, delivered with the directness that only children possessed, cut straight to the heart of what Marcus had been avoiding. He found himself looking into those enormous eyes, so much like her mother's, but filled with the absolute trust that came before the world taught you to be careful, and felt something crack open in his chest. "What do you think?" he asked, surprising himself. "Would you like to stay?" Kira considered this with the gravity of a diplomatic negotiation. "Do you have books?" "Some, military manuals mostly, technical specifications. I could teach you to read better stories," she offered solemnly. "Mama knows lots of good ones, and Jax can fix things that are broken. What about you? What can you do?" Kira's face lit up with sudden enthusiasm. "I can make things grow even in ice places. Mama says I have gift for life systems." Marcus felt the last of his defenses crumble completely. This was how the greatest science fiction stories began, not with grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but with small offers of help, with children volunteering to teach adults how to read better stories, with the gradual recognition that healing comes in unexpected packages. "Well," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "it sounds like we're going to need all the help we can get." Kira beamed at him, and for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Kane smiled back without reservation. Outside, Nevada 13 remained as hostile and unforgiving as ever, but inside the outpost, something warm was beginning to take root. The kind of warmth that had nothing to do with heating systems and everything to do with the peculiar alchemy that transforms strangers into family. The best bedtime stories and audio stories, Marcus realized, weren't about happy endings. They were about new beginnings, about the moment when broken people choose to trust each other enough to start healing together. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those short stories stretched into something longer, something that felt dangerously like hope. As Jax began to stir and Zara moved to check his bandages, Marcus Kane made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He was going to try again. He was going to risk caring about people who might not survive his protection. Because sometimes the greatest space stories were really human stories in disguise, and sometimes the most alien thing you could encounter was the possibility of your own redemption. The screaming started at Euro 347 hours, according to the chronometer beside Marcus Kane's cot. Not the wind he'd learned to distinguish between Nevada 13's natural fury and the sounds that came from broken souls 3 years ago. This was human anguish, raw and primal, tearing through the carefully maintained quiet of the outpost like plasma fire through ship's hull. Marcus was moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the sound muscle memory, and 3 years of isolation hypervigilance launching him from sleep to full alertness in seconds. The nightmare had him again. In the dim emergency lighting that provided the outpost's night illumination, Marcus found himself pressed against the far wall of the main compartment, his service pistol in hand, though he had no memory of retrieving it. Cold sweat plastered his thermal shirt to his skin, and his breathing came in sharp, controlled bursts, the measured rhythm of someone fighting to stay grounded in reality, while his mind replayed the worst moments of the Proxima Centauri campaign. The familiar taste of copper and smoke filled his mouth, phantom sensations that 3 years of exile hadn't been enough to erase. "Papa Marcus," the voice was small, concerned, cutting through the chaos in his head like a thermal blade through ice. Papa Marcus, you're having bad dreams again. Marcus blinked, vision slowly clearing to reveal Kira standing beside his cot, her enormous amber eyes reflecting the red glow of the emergency lights. She wore the oversized thermal shirt he'd modified to serve as a nightgown, her silver hair tousled from sleep, but her expression alert with the particular gravity that children develop when they've learned to recognize adult distress. In her small hands, she clutched the improvised doll Zara had crafted from spare fabric and insulation material, a constant companion that had helped ease her transition to their strange new life. "Kira!" Marcus's voice came out as a rasp, his throat raw from the screaming he couldn't remember doing. "What are you—" "It's the middle of the night cycle. You should be sleeping." "You were loud," she said, with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possessed. "Like when the storms first came and Mama couldn't sleep either. But you looked scared, so I thought maybe you needed someone to sit with you." The simple offer, delivered without judgment or expectation, hit Marcus harder than any enemy bombardment ever had. In 3 years of isolation, no one had offered to sit with him during the dark hours when the nightmares came calling. He'd fought those battles alone, convinced that solitude was safer than risking someone else's well-being on his damaged psyche. But here was this small alien child offering comfort to a broken soldier with the same natural instinct that had driven her mother to risk everything for her children's survival. Marcus slowly holstered his weapon hands, still trembling slightly from adrenaline, and remembered terror. "You don't have to do that, little star. I'm fine." "Mama says that too sometimes," Kira observed, settling cross-legged on the floor beside his cot, with the patient determination of someone who intended to stay put. "She gets the quiet, loud feelings when she thinks about Papa Darian, but she's not really fine until someone sits with her." The phrase, "quiet, loud feelings," was so perfectly descriptive of PTSD that Marcus felt something crack in his chest. This child, barely 4 years old by human standards, had developed her own vocabulary for trauma responses because she'd learned to recognize them in the adults responsible for her safety. It was the kind of premature wisdom that transformed ordinary family stories into something both heartbreaking and profound. The recognition that children often became emotional caregivers for parents who had been forced to grow up too fast themselves. "The quiet, loud feelings," Marcus repeated softly. That's actually a very good way to describe it." Kira nodded solemnly. "Jax gets them too, but different. His make him angry at broken things. Mine make me want to fix everything so nobody has to hurt anymore." She tilted her head, studying his face with the disconcerting directness that seemed to run in her family. "What do yours make you want to do?" Marcus considered the question with more seriousness than he'd given to most military intelligence briefings. "Hide," he admitted finally. "They make me want to hide where I can't hurt anyone else by making the wrong choices. But you didn't make wrong choices with us," Kira pointed out with irrefutable logic. "You made good choices. You let us in when we were cold, and you shared your food even though there wasn't very much, and you made Jax's feet better even when he was scared of the medical thing. That was different." "How?" Marcus opened his mouth to explain the complexity of command decisions under fire, the weight of strategic considerations and acceptable losses, the difference between saving 3 refugees and leading 37 soldiers into a death trap. But looking into those enormous amber eyes filled with absolute trust and genuine curiosity, he found the words dissolving before they could form. "How did you explain to a child that sometimes saving people meant getting other people killed? How did you describe the mathematical brutality of military logistics to someone who believed that all problems could be solved by sitting with people during their dark moments?" "It's complicated," he said finally, which was the universal adult admission of defeat when faced with childhood logic. Kira accepted this with the gracious patience of someone who had learned to work around adult emotional limitations. "Mama says complicated things get simpler when you have help." Maybe your quiet, loud feelings would be smaller if you told someone about them. Before Marcus could respond to that observation, soft footsteps announced Zara's approach. She emerged from the sleeping area wearing the modified thermal coveralls that had become her standard attire, her silver hair braided back and her expression carrying the particular alertness of a parent responding to disturbance in the night. In the red-tinted emergency lighting, her pale blue skin seemed to glow with an inner luminescence that reminded Marcus of bioluminescent organisms he'd encountered on deep space missions, beautiful and otherworldly, but unmistakably alive. "Is everything all right?" Zara's voice carried the careful modulation of someone trying not to wake a sleeping household, while simultaneously assessing for potential threats. Her amber eyes moved between Marcus and Kira, taking in his disheveled state, and her daughter's vigil with the rapid analysis of a mother who had learned to read emotional weather patterns like a survival skill. "Papa, Marcus had bad dreams," Kira explained with clinical precision. "The kind that make noise. I'm sitting with him until they go away." Zara's expression softened, a complex mix of maternal pride and sympathetic recognition crossing her features. "Ah? The night terrors?" She moved closer, settling gracefully on the floor beside her daughter, with the fluid motion that spoke to her species' lower gravity origins. "We know those well, don't we, little star? Mama gets them about the bad men who wanted to hurt us," Kira said with the casual matter-of-factness that children used to discuss even the most traumatic subjects. "And about Papa Darien when the pirates came. But they're smaller now than they used to be." Marcus felt something twist in his stomach, a combination of protective rage at the bad men who had traumatized this family and grudging admiration for their resilience in the face of experiences that would have broken many adults. "How do you make them smaller?" Zara studied his face in the dim lighting, her amber eyes reflecting depths of understanding that spoke to shared experience with trauma and healing. "Time helps, so does safety, real safety, not just the absence of immediate threat, but mostly—" She glanced at Kira, who nodded encouragingly. "Mostly, it helps to remember that surviving isn't the same thing as living." "I don't understand. For 3 years you've been surviving," Zara said gently. "Maintaining systems rationing supplies, enduring each day until the next one arrived. That's not living, that's existing in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something to change without allowing yourself to hope for change." Marcus felt the accuracy of the observation like a physical blow. "Hope is dangerous. When you hope for things, when you care about outcomes, you make decisions based on emotion instead of logic. People die because of those decisions. People die because of purely logical decisions too," Zara pointed out with the quiet certainty of someone who had experienced both kinds of loss. "The difference is whether their deaths serve a purpose beyond mere calculation." Before Marcus could formulate a response to that philosophical challenge, a new voice cut through the conversation from the sleeping area. "Is everyone having a midnight philosophy discussion without me?" Jax appeared in the entrance to the main compartment, moving with the careful gait of someone whose feet were still healing, but who refused to acknowledge pain. At 6 years old, he carried himself with the dignity of someone much older, though the thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders and the slight lisp caused by missing baby teeth reminded observers of his actual age. "Jax, you should be resting," Zara said with automatic maternal concern. "Your feet need time to heal properly." "They're fine," Jax insisted, with the stubborn pride that seemed to be a family trait. "Besides, Papa Marcus sounded really upset. I wanted to make sure everyone was okay." The casual use of Papa Marcus hit like a thermal detonator to the chest. Marcus found himself staring at this small boy who had somehow decided that a broken ex-soldier deserved the title of father figure, despite having known him for less than a week. It was the kind of unconditional acceptance that made the best HFY stories and human stories transcend their science fiction origins to become something approaching universal truth. the recognition that families weren't built from blood relations, but from the daily choice to care about each other's well-being. "I'm okay," Marcus managed, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Just old memories that don't want to stay buried." Jax considered this with the gravity of someone who had learned to navigate adult emotional complexity at a very young age. "The war memories." Marcus nodded, surprised by the boy's perceptiveness. "Mama says war breaks pieces inside people," Jax said, settling on the floor beside his sister and mother with careful movements that protected his healing feet. "But she also says broken pieces can grow back stronger if you give them enough time and help. What if the pieces that broke were the ones that made good decisions?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about this child's perspective on moral complexity. What if losing those pieces means you can't trust yourself not to hurt people anymore? Jax tilted his head, amber eyes reflecting his mother's intelligent directness. "But you saved us. That was a good decision." "That was easy. You were freezing to death on my doorstep. Any decent person would have made the same choice." "The bad men wouldn't have," Kira interjected with stark honesty. "They would have taken us inside and hurt us and sent us away again. You gave us food and fixed our hurts and let us stay even though your food numbers got smaller." Marcus felt the breath leave his lungs as if he'd been struck. In the complex mathematics of military logistics and strategic planning, he'd lost sight of something fundamental. The recognition that moral choices didn't always require impossible calculations between competing goods. Sometimes they were as simple as choosing kindness over cruelty, protection over exploitation, hope over fear. "The memories that wake you up," Zara said softly, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Are they about the people you couldn't save?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "Tell us about them." The request was so simple, so direct, that Marcus found himself complying before his defensive instincts could engage. Sarah Chen, 23 years old, communications specialist from New Tokyo. She wanted to be a teacher after her service term ended. David Rodriguez, combat engineer, had 2 kids and a husband waiting for him on Mars Colony. Emma Walsh, his voice caught slightly. Emma was 25, tactical officer, brilliant strategic mind. She could have commanded her own ship within high years. "They were your friends," Kira observed, with the directness that characterized her approach to complex subjects. "They were my responsibility. I was supposed to bring them home." "Did they choose to follow you?" Zara asked gently. "Of course they did. They were soldiers. So they made the same choice you did to risk their lives for something they believed was important." Marcus felt the logic of the statement warring with 3 years of carefully cultivated guilt. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Jax's voice carried surprising firmness for someone so young. "Mama taught us that people make choices. Bad people choose to hurt others. Good people choose to help even when it's dangerous. Your friends chose to help just like you chose to help us." The conversation was interrupted by a soft electronic chime from the environmental systems console, the routine hourly check that confirmed life support was functioning within normal parameters. But the sound seemed to break some kind of spell, drawing everyone's attention to the reality of their situation. 4 people huddled together in the middle of the night on one of the most hostile worlds in known space, offering comfort and wisdom to each other as if they were family members of long standing, rather than refugees who had found each other by accident. "It's late," Zara said, finally, though her tone suggested reluctance to break up the gathering. "We should try to get some more sleep." "Will you be okay, Papa Marcus?" Kira asked with genuine concern. "Or do you need someone to sit with you until the bad dreams go away?" Marcus looked at these 3 beings who had somehow become the center of his universe in less than a week, who offered protection and comfort to a broken soldier without asking for anything in return except the opportunity to be part of something that felt like family. "I think I'll be okay," he said quietly. "But maybe we could do this again sometime. Talk about things, I mean." "Tomorrow night," Jax suggested with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a new and interesting adult ritual. "Tomorrow night." Marcus agreed, and felt something that had been frozen solid for 3 years begin to thaw around the edges. As his makeshift family settled back into their sleeping arrangements, Marcus lay staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft sounds of other people breathing in the same space. For the first time since Proxima Centauri, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt companionable. The kind of shared quiet that turned alien stories into bedtime stories, space stories into family chronicles, short stories into the beginning of something that might last a lifetime. Sometimes broken pieces fit together perfectly, he realized. Sometimes the greatest science fiction stories were really about the most mundane human miracle of all the way that strangers could choose to become family, and family could choose to heal together. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the people who saved you turned out to be the same people you saved in return. Outside, Nevada 13's perpetual winter continued its assault on the outpost, but inside, something warm was taking root. The kind of warmth that had nothing to do with heating systems and everything to do with the recognition that audio, stories, and Reddit stories might be entertainment, but living with people who cared about your nightmares. That was the stuff of real life, in all its messy, complicated, absolutely essential glory. The first warning came at 03:12 hours, on what Marcus Kane's chronometer insisted was day 47 of their cohabitation, though the perpetual twilight of Nevada 13's winter made precise timekeeping feel like an exercise in futility. The primary heating core hiccuped a barely perceptible fluctuation in the steady hum that had become the soundtrack to their makeshift family life. Marcus felt it in his bones before the diagnostic systems registered the anomaly, 3 years of solitary existence, having attuned him to every mechanical heartbeat of the outpost that kept death at bay. He was awake, instantly moving from the shallow sleep of someone who had learned never to trust complete unconsciousness. The temperature reading showed a drop of 2 degrees Celsius, insignificant under normal circumstances, but on a world where the ambient temperature outside hovered at -68 degrees, any fluctuation in life support was a potential death sentence. The kind of crisis that transformed the most heartwarming HFY stories into stark reminders that the universe remained fundamentally hostile to human survival, regardless of how much love and determination you brought to the equation. Marcus. Zara's voice carried the immediate alertness of someone who had spent too many years listening for danger in the night. She was already sitting up in the expanded sleeping area he'd cobbled together from storage compartments and emergency blankets, her silver hair catching the red glow of the warning lights that had begun their silent dance across the control panels. "System fluctuation," he replied quietly, not wanting to wake the children unless absolutely necessary. "Probably nothing serious, but I should check it out." But even as he spoke, Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his stomach, the same pre-battle tension that had preceded every major disaster of his military career. The heating core had been showing signs of strain for weeks, pushed beyond its designed capacity by the addition of 3 extra life forms to support. He'd been nursing it along with jury-rigged repairs and careful power management, but Nevada 13's winter was proving longer and more brutal than any in the 3 years since his arrival. The diagnostic readout painted a picture that confirmed his worst fears. Primary heating element showing 73% efficiency and dropping. Secondary backup system offline for scheduled maintenance. A maintenance cycle he'd been forced to delay because shutting down the backup while supporting 4 people would have been suicide. Power consumption running at 127% of recommended levels, drawing more energy than the aging solar collectors could reliably provide during the planet's abbreviated daylight hours. How bad? Zara had joined him at the control station, moving with the fluid silence of someone who understood the importance of not disturbing sleeping children during a crisis. Her amber eyes reflected the warning lights, giving her an otherworldly beauty that seemed incongruous with the technical readouts that spelled potential disaster in stark digital precision. Bad enough. Marcus's fingers danced across the control interface, calling up system schematics and power distribution charts with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years keeping complex systems operational under adverse conditions. The heating core is failing. Not catastrophically, not yet, but it's been running beyond design specifications for too long. We're looking at maybe 12 hours before we start losing the ability to maintain livable temperatures. The words hung between them like a death sentence. 12 hours to find a solution to a problem that should require a full engineering team and a properly equipped maintenance facility. 12 hours to jury-rig repairs with salvaged components and improvised tools while keeping 2 children warm and safe and unaware that their newfound family might be facing its final crisis. "What do you need me to do?" Zara asked, and Marcus felt something inside his chest tighten at the absolute trust in her voice. No panic, no recriminations about their decision to stay on Nevada 13, no desperate suggestions about evacuation procedures that didn't exist. Just the calm competence of someone who had learned to face impossible situations with grace and determination. "Wake Jax, but gently. Tell him we're having some technical difficulties and I could use his help with repairs. Kid's got good hands for mechanical work, might be useful if I need someone small enough to reach tight spaces." Marcus was already pulling diagnostic equipment from storage lockers, his mind racing through possible solutions and their probability of success. "Keep Kira with you. Try to maintain normal routine as much as possible. No point in terrifying her unless we absolutely have to." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of increasingly desperate engineering improvisation. Marcus found himself crawling through maintenance tunnels that hadn't been accessed in years, following power conduits and heating distribution lines, while Jax held lights and handed him tools with the focused concentration of someone who understood that lives depended on his precision. The boy asked no questions about why they were working in such grim silence, content to follow instructions and offer small suggestions that occasionally proved remarkably insightful. The fundamental problem was elegantly simple and completely insoluble with their available resources. The heating core's primary fusion reaction chamber was suffering from magnetic containment field degradation, a slow leak that allowed superheated plasma to contact the chamber walls, gradually eroding the containment system from within. Under normal circumstances, the solution would be replacement of the magnetic field generators with fresh components from a properly equipped supply depot. But they were 3 sectors away from the nearest civilization, trapped on a world that killed unprotected humans in minutes, with nothing but salvaged parts and desperate ingenuity. "We could try rerouting power from non-essential systems," Jax suggested during a brief rest break. His young face serious as he studied the schematic Marcus had pulled up on a portable display. "Life support for the unused sections, maybe the communications array that doesn't work anyway." Marcus felt a surge of paternal pride at the boy's logical approach to problem-solving, even as he recognized the fundamental inadequacy of the suggestion. "Good thinking, but we're already running everything that can be safely shut down. The power shortage isn't the primary issue, it's the physical degradation of the containment field generators. Like trying to hold water in a bucket with holes that keep getting bigger." By hour 8, Marcus was forced to acknowledge what he'd known since the first diagnostic readout: there was no engineering solution to their crisis with available resources. The heating core would fail completely within the next few hours, and Nevada 13's winter would reclaim the outpost with the same indifferent efficiency that had claimed so many other human settlements on hostile worlds. The kind of stark reality that reminded audiences why Reddit stories and science fiction stories about survival in space usually ended with rescue missions rather than families dying quietly in the dark. It was Zara who suggested the impossible solution, approaching the problem from a perspective that Marcus's military engineering training had never equipped him to consider. She appeared in the maintenance compartment where he and Jax were attempting to fabricate replacement components from recycled materials, carrying Kira and wearing an expression of calm determination that seemed incongruous with their dire circumstances. "What if we don't try to fix the heating core?" she said without preamble. Marcus looked up from the molecular assembler he'd been coaxing into producing magnetic field components from salvaged metals, sweat stinging his eyes despite the steadily dropping temperature. "Zara, we've been through this. Without the heating core, we're dead in hours. The environmental systems can't maintain livable temperatures with just waste heat from other systems." "Not the environmental systems," she corrected gently. "Us. What if we don't rely on mechanical heating to survive?" The suggestion was so far outside standard survival protocols that Marcus initially dismissed it as stress-induced wishful thinking. But something in Zara's expression, the particular intensity that he'd learned to associate with her most profound insights, made him reconsider. "What are you talking about?" "Etherian physiological adaptations," she said, settling Kira on her lap and fixing Marcus with that direct amber gaze that seemed to see straight through his preconceptions. "We evolved on a world with extreme seasonal temperature variations. Our bodies have natural mechanisms for entering extended hibernation states, reducing metabolic requirements, sharing body heat more efficiently, surviving in conditions that would kill most other species." Marcus felt his brain attempting to process the implications while his military training supplied a dozen reasons why the plan was impossible. "Hibernation requires controlled conditions, medical monitoring, gradual preparation cycles. We're talking about improvised survival, not a planned medical procedure." "Not hibernation exactly," Zara clarified, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when explaining complex concepts to the children. "More like shared thermal regulation. Etherians can enter a state where multiple individuals synchronize their metabolic processes, sharing body heat and reducing overall energy requirements. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism. Families would huddle together during the worst weather, lowering their combined energy needs until conditions improved." "And humans?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Unknown. But human and Etherian physiologies are more compatible than most species, similar enough that we can share the same environment, eat similar foods, survive similar temperature ranges. It's possible that with close enough contact, a human might be able to benefit from our thermal regulation abilities." The plan that emerged over the next hour was equal parts desperate improvisation and profound trust in biological processes that neither of them fully understood. They would create what amounted to a thermal shelter within the outpost, a single small compartment, insulated with every available material, heated by their combined body heat and Etherian metabolic efficiency. They would huddle together like survivors of some ancient catastrophe, sharing warmth and breath and the fragile hope that love might prove more reliable than technology. The preparation took another 2 hours that they couldn't spare, time during which the heating core's efficiency dropped below 50%, and the outpost's internal temperature began falling toward levels that would make survival impossible without protective gear. Marcus found himself moving through the familiar emergency protocols with mechanical precision, sealing non-essential compartments, rerouting all available power to their improvised shelter, preparing emergency supplies for what might be days of enforced hibernation. But it was the emotional preparation that proved most challenging. As they gathered in the small compartment that would either become their salvation or their tomb, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. 3 lives depending on his decisions. 3 people trusting him to guide them through a crisis that had no guaranteed solution. The kind of impossible command situation that had haunted his nightmares since Proxima Centauri, except this time the people he was responsible for had become family. "I need you all to understand," he said, as they arranged themselves in the configuration Zara had described. Bodies pressed close together, sharing blankets and body heat in an embrace that felt simultaneously intimate and desperate. "This is completely theoretical. We don't know if it will work, and if it doesn't, then we'll face whatever comes together." Zara finished quietly, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had already made peace with the possibility of death. As a family, Kira, nestled between her mother and Marcus in the carefully orchestrated arrangement, looked up at him with those enormous amber eyes that seemed to hold far too much wisdom for someone so young. "Papa Marcus, are we going to be okay?" Marcus felt the question hit him like a physical blow, stripping away 3 years of emotional armor and leaving him face to face with the fundamental uncertainty that defined every parent's worst nightmare. He could offer reassurance he didn't feel could deploy the confident authority that had carried him through military crises, could lie with the smooth competence of someone who understood that leadership sometimes required deception. Instead, he chose honesty. "I don't know, little star, but I know that whatever happens, we're going to face it together. And sometimes, when you have the right people with you, that's enough." The heating core failed completely at 1847 hours. Its death announced by a sudden silence that seemed to echo through the outpost like the final breath of something that had struggled too long against impossible odds. The temperature began dropping immediately, slowly at first, then, with increasing speed as Nevada 13's brutal winter began reclaiming the artificial environment that had kept them alive. But in their small shelter, pressed together in an embrace that combined desperation with profound trust, something extraordinary began to happen. Marcus felt it first as warmth that seemed to emanate from Zara's skin, not the simple heat of shared body temperature, but something deeper, more fundamental. A synchronization of biological processes that his rational mind insisted was impossible, even as his body responded to the subtle chemical signals that spoke to evolutionary adaptations older than technology. His heart rate slowed, matching the rhythm of Zara's pulse where their wrists touched. His breathing deepened, synchronizing with the metabolic efficiency that allowed Etherians to survive conditions that would kill other species. Most remarkably, his core body temperature stabilized at a level that should have been insufficient for human survival, maintained by physiological processes he didn't understand, but could feel operating with the reliability of instinct. Hours passed, how many Marcus couldn't say, as time seemed to lose meaning in the strange twilight state between consciousness and sleep that characterized their shared hibernation. He was aware of the children's breathing, of Zara's heartbeat against his chest, of the way their combined warmth created a pocket of survival in the heart of a frozen world. It was the kind of profound intimacy that transformed space stories into human stories, that elevated mere survival into something approaching transcendence. When he finally opened his eyes, after what his chronometer insisted was 17 hours but felt like minutes or days, the first thing Marcus saw was Kira's face, inches from his own, her amber eyes bright with curiosity and something that looked remarkably like joy. "Good morning, Papa Marcus," she whispered, careful not to disturb the still sleeping Jax. "We made it through the night." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, not the familiar pain of old wounds, but the opposite. A warmth that had nothing to do with thermal regulation and everything to do with the recognition that some stories don't end with rescue or escape, but with the simple miracle of waking up surrounded by people who chose to face the darkness with you. "Yes," he whispered back, his voice rough with emotion and 17 hours of shared breathing. "We made it through." Outside their small shelter, Nevada 13's winter continued its assault on the outpost. But inside, surrounded by the people who had become his family, Marcus Kane understood something fundamental about survival that 3 years of solitude had failed to teach him. The greatest bedtime stories and audio stories weren't about technology or heroic individual achievement. They were about the way that love could literally generate heat, the way that trust could synchronize heartbeats, the way that choosing to face impossible odds together could transform strangers into something stronger than the sum of their parts. True family, he realized, was forged in the crucible of hardship. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the people who saved your life turned out to be the same people who made it worth living in the first place. The kind of alien stories that reminded you that the most profound science fiction stories were really human stories in disguise, exploring what it meant to choose connection over safety, love over survival together, over alone. Sometimes the longest winters ended not with the return of spring, but with the recognition that you had been warm all along. The first sign of spring on Nevada 13 came not with warmth, but with silence. After 5 months of perpetual wind howl and the constant assault of ice against the outpost's walls, the sudden absence of sound felt almost supernatural, as if the planet itself had drawn breath and forgotten to exhale. Marcus Kane woke to this unnatural quiet at 647 hours, his internal chronometer still functioning, despite the shared hibernation that had carried them through the worst of the winter crisis, and found himself listening to something he hadn't experienced in over 3 years, the possibility of change. The heating core hummed with renewed efficiency, its repairs holding steady after 2 weeks of anxious monitoring. The improvised thermal regulation system that had saved their lives during the crisis now seemed like a distant nightmare, though the memory of shared warmth and synchronized heartbeats remained vivid in ways that made Marcus's chest tighten with emotions he wasn't ready to examine too closely. They had survived the longest winter in Nevada 13's recorded history, and in the process 4 strangers had become something that felt dangerously like a real family. Papa Marcus, Kira's voice carried the particular brightness that children possessed when announcing discoveries that adults had missed. "The ice walls are crying." Marcus turned from the diagnostic panel he'd been studying to find her pressed against the main viewport, her small hands leaving prints on the reinforced transparistile as she watched something outside with the fascination that only a 4-year-old could bring to natural phenomena. Following her gaze, he realized she was right. The thick layer of ice that had coated the outpost's exterior for months was beginning to melt, sending rivulets of water down the walls like tears of relief. "The temperature's rising," he confirmed, checking the external sensors and finding readings that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "Nevada 13 has seasons, but they're unpredictable. We might be looking at a brief thaw before the next freeze cycle." "Or," Zara said from the food preparation area, her voice carrying a musical quality that Marcus had learned to associate with Etherean hopefulness, "we might be looking at the beginning of something wonderful." She moved with the fluid grace that had become familiar over the months of their cohabitation, her silver hair catching the pale light that filtered through the melting ice with an otherworldly beauty. The harsh lines of starvation and desperation that had marked her features during their first meeting had softened into something that approached contentment, not happiness exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found safety after a long journey through darkness. The transformation in all of them was remarkable. Jax had grown several centimeters during their winter isolation, his feet finally healing completely from the frostbite damage, and his mechanical aptitude had developed to the point where Marcus trusted him with maintenance tasks that would have challenged trained technicians. The boy still carried himself with premature seriousness, but moments of genuine childhood had begun to surface, laughter during their improvised lessons, excitement when successfully repairing a malfunctioning system, the innocent pride of someone discovering his own competence. Kira had bloomed like a flower in an unexpected garden, her natural curiosity finding expression in a dozen small projects that had transformed the sterile military outpost into something approaching a home. Her drawings covered every available surface, fantastical creatures from Etherean folklore mixed with surprisingly accurate technical diagrams of outpost systems, family portraits that always included Marcus with the casual acceptance of belonging that still took his breath away. But it was the change in himself that Marcus found most unsettling. 3 years of careful isolation had been systematically dismantled by the simple presence of people who needed him for reasons that had nothing to do with military command or strategic decision-making. He had learned to read bedtime stories in 2 languages, to braid Etherean hair, using techniques Zara had taught him during long winter evenings, to find satisfaction in the mundane challenges of family life that bore no resemblance to the high-stakes decision-making that had defined his previous existence. "What do you think Papa Marcus?" Jax appeared beside his sister at the viewport, his amber eyes reflecting the same excitement that animated Kira's expression. "Could we maybe go outside today?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. For 5 months, the world beyond their walls had represented nothing but death temperatures that could kill in minutes, storms that could strip flesh from bone, an environment so hostile that even brief exposure required full environmental suits and emergency protocols. The idea of stepping outside for pleasure rather than necessity felt revolutionary. "Maybe," Marcus said carefully, his mind already running through safety protocols and risk assessments with the automatic precision of someone who had spent too many years keeping people alive in hostile environments. "Let me check the weather patterns first, make sure this isn't just a temporary fluctuation." But even as he spoke, Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with tactical planning and everything to do with hope. The external temperature reading showed a steady climb toward levels that might actually be survivable with proper protection. The wind speed had dropped to levels that wouldn't require anchoring systems. For the first time since their arrival on Nevada 13, the world outside their walls might offer something other than immediate death. "We could start the garden project," Zara suggested, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone making a suggestion that could change everything. "If the conditions remain stable for even a few weeks, we might be able to establish food production that could supplement our stored supplies." The garden project. They had been discussing it in theoretical terms for weeks, the possibility of creating a small agricultural plot using salvaged materials and Etherian botanical knowledge. Zara's people had developed techniques for growing food in hostile environments, adaptations that might allow them to achieve something approaching self-sufficiency on a world that had never been intended to support human life. But more than the practical implications, the garden represented something that made Marcus's throat tighten with emotions he didn't want to examine too closely. Permanence. The kind of long-term planning that assumed they would still be together months or years in the future, that this makeshift family was something worth building, rather than something to be endured until better options presented themselves. It would require significant resource allocation, Marcus heard himself saying, though his heart wasn't in the practical objection. Soil synthesizers, atmospheric processors, genetic modification of existing plant stocks to adapt to local conditions. Even with Etherian expertise, we're talking about a project that could take years to achieve meaningful results. "We have time," Kira said, with the absolute certainty that characterized childhood logic. "We're not going anywhere, are we?" The innocent question hit like a thermal detonator to the chest. Marcus found himself looking at these 3 beings who had somehow become the center of his universe, who offered love and trust and the promise of belonging without asking for anything more complicated than his presence in return. The kind of human stories that elevated science fiction stories beyond mere entertainment into something approaching universal truth. The recognition that home wasn't a place, but a collection of people who chose to build something together. "No," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "We're not going anywhere." The smile that spread across Kira's face was like sunrise, after endless night, bright and warm, and filled with the particular joy that children brought to moments of adult decision-making. Even Jax, normally so serious and controlled, allowed himself a small expression of satisfaction that spoke to how much this confirmation meant to their sense of security. But it was Zara's reaction that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. She turned from the food preparation area to face him directly, her amber eyes reflecting depths of emotion that spoke to shared understanding of what he had just committed to. Not just survival, not just temporary sanctuary, but the choice to build something permanent together. The kind of choice that transformed refugee stories into family chronicles, that elevated alien stories into something universal and profound. "Then we should start planning properly," she said, her voice carrying the practical authority of someone who had learned to build hope from limited resources. "If we're going to stay, if we're going to make this work long-term, We need to think about infrastructure improvements, resource sustainability, education systems for the children. The conversation that followed felt like the most important strategic planning session of Marcus's life, though it bore no resemblance to the military briefings that had defined his previous existence. They discussed soil composition and atmospheric processing educational curricula that would prepare Jax and Kira for adult responsibilities on a frontier world, communication systems that might allow limited contact with other settlements without compromising their security. But underneath the practical discussion ran an emotional current that transformed everything. The recognition that they were no longer surviving but planning, no longer enduring but building. The kind of transformation that made the best HFY stories resonate across species boundaries, that elevated space stories into human stories about the fundamental drive to create something meaningful from the materials at hand. "There's something else we need to discuss," Zara said during a pause in their planning, her voice carrying a gravity that made Marcus look up from the technical specifications he'd been sketching. "If we're committing to long-term settlement, if we're building something permanent, then we need to address the question of outside contact." The observation settled over the room like a cold wind, carrying implications that Marcus had been avoiding for weeks. Nevada 13's isolation had been both protection and prison, keeping them safe from the conflicts and complications of galactic civilization, while also cutting them off from resources, opportunities, and connections that might enhance their long-term prospects. "The communication array," Marcus said slowly, his mind already working through the technical challenges and political complications that restoration would entail. "I could probably get it functional again with a few weeks of work. The question is whether we want to." "It's not just about what we want," Jax said with the precocious wisdom that characterized his approach to adult problems. "It's about what's fair to Kira and me. Are we choosing isolation for ourselves, or are we choosing it for our children too?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Marcus to confront assumptions he hadn't realized he was making. The decision to stay on Nevada 13 had felt like choosing safety and simplicity over the complex dangers of galactic civilization. But from the children's perspective, it might look more like choosing limitation over opportunity, security over growth. "What do you think?" Zara asked gently, her amber eyes moving between her children with the careful attention of a parent, genuinely seeking input rather than simply going through the motions of consultation. "Do you want the possibility of contact with other people, other worlds, or does this feel like home enough to build your lives here?" Kira considered the question with the gravity that she brought to all important decisions, her small face scrunched in concentration as she weighed options that would have challenged adults. "I like it here," she said finally. "I like our family, and I like that nobody tries to hurt us. But—" She paused, glancing at Marcus with eyes that seemed to hold far too much wisdom for someone so young. "But maybe we could have both. Maybe we could stay here and still talk to other people sometimes. Limited contact." Marcus mused, his strategic mind automatically beginning to assess the possibilities and risks. Carefully controlled communication that allows information exchange without compromising our location or security. It's theoretically possible. "And practically?" Zara asked, with the directness that he had learned to appreciate as one of her most valuable qualities. "Complicated, but not impossible." Marcus found himself warming to the challenge, despite his instinctive preference for complete isolation. "We could establish communication protocols that allow selective contact, emergency services, educational resources, limited trade relationships. Keep the outpost officially listed as abandoned while maintaining back-channel access to galactic infrastructure." It was the kind of complex operational planning that reminded Marcus why he had been an effective military commander, but it felt different now. Instead of calculating acceptable losses and strategic advantages, he was designing systems to protect and nurture something precious. The shift in perspective was subtle but profound, the difference between commanding troops and protecting family. "Spring Project Number 2. Zara said with a smile that made something warm unfurl in Marcus's chest. Garden and communication array, assuming the weather continues to cooperate. And if it doesn't, Kira asked with the practical concern of someone who had learned not to take good fortune for granted. Marcus looked around the outpost that had become home at the children's drawings, covering the walls, and the improvised improvements that spoke to months of shared living at Zara's face, reflecting the same mixture of hope and determination that characterized his own feelings about their strange little family. "Then we adapt," he said simply. "We survive, we take care of each other, same as we've been doing. Together," Jax added with quiet emphasis. "Together," Marcus confirmed, and felt the words settle into his chest like an anchor. Not the kind that held you back, but the kind that kept you steady when everything else was shifting. Outside, Nevada 13's brief spring continued its subtle transformation of the landscape, melting ice into possibility and silence into hope. Inside the outpost, 4 refugees who had become family continued the more complex work of building something that could last, not just survival, but life. The kind of life that proved the greatest audio stories and bedtime stories weren't about grand adventures or impossible heroics, but about the daily choice to create meaning from whatever materials the universe provided. Sometimes, the best Reddit stories and short stories were the ones that reminded you that home isn't a place you find, it's something you build one day at a time with the people who choose to stay. The signal came at 14:23 hours on what Marcus Kane's chronometer insisted was day 18 of Nevada 13's brief spring, though the timestamp felt irrelevant in the face of what was happening on his communication display. 3 weeks of painstaking work had finally restored the outpost's long-range array to minimal functionality, and the first incoming transmission in over 3 years was painting a picture that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. "Marcus." Zara's voice carried an urgency that made him look up from the decryption protocols he'd been running. She stood in the entryway to the communication chamber, her amber eyes reflecting attention that spoke to maternal instincts operating at full alert. "Jax is missing." The words hit like a kinetic round to the chest. Marcus felt his mind immediately shift into crisis mode. 3 years of family life, overriding decades of military training as parental fear, flooded his system with adrenaline and desperate clarity. Missing how, when? He went out to check the atmospheric processors an hour ago. Standard maintenance run should have taken 20 minutes maximum. Zara's voice remained controlled, but Marcus could see the barely contained panic in her posture, the way her hands clenched and unclenched as she fought to maintain composure. "He's not responding to comm calls, and the tracking beacon in his environmental suit went dark 15 minutes ago." Marcus was already moving his hands, flying over the emergency protocols that had become second nature during their months of settlement. External sensor sweeps, atmospheric analysis, emergency beacon activation, all the technological safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. But Nevada 13 had a way of making even the most careful precautions feel inadequate when faced with the simple fact that their 6-year-old son was alone somewhere on one of the most hostile worlds in known space. "Environmental conditions?" Marcus asked, though he was already pulling up the readings on his secondary display. The spring thaw had made Nevada 13 marginally more survivable, but marginally was a relative term when applied to a world where unprotected exposure still meant death in minutes. Stable but deteriorating. Winds picking up from the east, temperature dropping. If he's lost shelter... Zara didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both understood the mathematics of survival on Nevada 13, had lived with those calculations for months. Time was not on their side. "Where's Kira?" Marcus asked, already suiting up in the emergency gear that had been a constant presence near the outpost's main entrance. Emergency bunker secured and monitored. She wanted to help search, but... Zara's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of how much effort she was expending to maintain control. "I can't lose both of them." Marcus paused in his preparations, moved by an impulse that had nothing to do with tactical planning, and everything to do with the recognition that terror shared was terror halved. He crossed to Zara, took her face in his hands, and looked directly into those amber eyes that had become the anchor of his emotional world. "We're going to find him," he said with absolute conviction. "Jax is smart, trained, prepared. He knows the protocols, knows the terrain, and he's got something most lost people don't have: a family that will never stop looking for him." Zara nodded, drawing strength from his certainty in a way that reminded Marcus how much their relationship had evolved from desperate strangers to genuine partners. "The communication array," she said. "You were getting readings when I came in. If we need to call for help." Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he remembered the transmission that had been interrupted by Jax's disappearance. "That's complicated. The signal we received wasn't a rescue beacon or civilian traffic. It was military encrypted with Earth Defense Corps protocols that shouldn't exist anymore. The implications hung between them like a challenge. For 3 years, they had lived in isolation, building a life that existed outside the complications of galactic politics and military obligations. The restoration of their communication array was supposed to provide them with carefully controlled access to education, trade, and emergency services, not drag them back into the conflicts they had fled. But with Jax missing, abstract concerns about political exposure felt insignificant compared to the immediate necessity of using every available resource to find their son. "Can you decrypt it?" Zara asked, her tone carrying the practical focus of someone who understood that survival sometimes required engaging with uncomfortable realities. "Already in progress," Marcus replied, his fingers dancing across the control interface with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years working with military encryption systems. "But it's going to take time we don't have. Priority 1 is search and rescue. We deal with external complications after we get Jax home safe." The search began with methodical precision, following protocols that Marcus had drilled into both children during their early months on Nevada 13. Jax had been conducting routine maintenance on Atmospheric Processor Station 3, located roughly 2 kilometers from the main outpost along a route that had been cleared and marked with emergency beacons. The journey should have been routine, safe, boring, exactly the kind of mundane family responsibility that characterized their daily life on the frontier. But the beacon trail ended abruptly at a ravine that hadn't existed the previous week. Nevada 13's spring thaw had destabilized a section of permafrost, creating a geological shift that transformed familiar terrain into something alien and dangerous. Equipment scattered across the newly formed crevasse told a story that made Marcus's throat close with terror. Jax had been walking the routine path when the ground beneath him simply ceased to exist. "Environmental suit integrity," Zara asked, her voice barely steady as they rappelled down into the ravine, following the trace signatures that their equipment had finally managed to lock onto. "Compromised, but functional," Marcus replied, reading the telemetry from Jax's emergency beacon with the clinical precision that kept panic at bay. "Life support, running on backup power, maybe 4 hours remaining if he's unconscious and metabolic demand is low." They found him 30 meters down, wedged between 2 rock formations in a position that had probably saved his life by preventing a longer fall. Jax was conscious but groggy, his environmental suit's emergency medical systems having deployed sedatives to manage what appeared to be a significant head injury. The sight of his pale face behind the suit's faceplate streaked with blood, but alert enough to recognize their approach, made Marcus feel something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness that had redefined his understanding of what mattered. "Papa, Marcus." Jax's voice came through the comm system as a weak whisper, but it carried the particular relief that children reserved for the moment when they knew rescue had arrived. "I think I made a mistake." "No mistakes," Marcus replied, his voice rougher than he intended as he began the careful process of extraction. "Just bad luck and unstable geology. You followed protocols, stayed calm, activated your beacon. You did everything right." The extraction took 2 hours of careful work, complicated by Jax's injury and the unstable nature of the rock formation that had become his temporary prison. But when they finally hauled him up to surface level, when Marcus was able to hold his son's small body and feel the steady rhythm of breathing that confirmed continued life, the relief was so profound that it felt like resurrection. Medical assessment. Zara said, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone shifting from panicked parent to competent caregiver. Concussion probable, but pupil response is good. No obvious fractures, suit integrity maintained throughout the incident. He's going to be fine. I was trying to get to the backup atmospheric processor, Jax mumbled as they made their way back to the outpost, his words slightly slurred but coherent. The primary unit was showing fluctuations that didn't make sense. I thought if I could cross-reference the readings. Marcus felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the reminder that his son had inherited not just his analytical approach to problem-solving, but also his tendency to take responsibility for systems beyond his immediate control. The atmospheric readings can wait, he said gently. Sometimes the most important job is knowing when not to be a hero. But what if the readings were indicating something important? What if there's a problem with the life support systems that we're not seeing? Jax's voice carried the particular anxiety of someone who had learned that small oversights could have catastrophic consequences on worlds like Nevada 13. It was Zara who provided the answer, her voice carrying the warmth and wisdom that had made her the emotional center of their unconventional family. Then we'll figure it out together when you're healed and rested and thinking clearly. That's what families do. We share the burden of keeping each other safe. Back at the outpost, as Marcus tended to Jax's injuries with the methodical care of someone who had learned field medicine through necessity rather than training, the restored communication array continued its persistent electronic chiming. The encrypted transmission that had been interrupted by the search and rescue operation was still waiting, still demanding attention, still representing the outside world's ability to intrude on the life they had built in isolation. "You should answer it," Jax said from the medical bay, his voice carrying surprising strength despite the head injury and the sedatives that Zara had administered. "If it's military traffic using Earth Defense Corps protocols, it might be important." Marcus paused in his examination of the boy's pupils, struck by the mature recognition that their family's safety might depend on understanding threats from beyond Nevada 13's atmosphere. "How do you know about Earth Defense Corps protocols?" "I've been studying the technical manuals you brought from your service," Jax admitted with the slight embarrassment of someone confessing to unauthorized research. "I wanted to understand the systems better so I could help with maintenance and repairs, and I wanted to understand you better." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him how much these children had invested in becoming part of his life, how thoroughly they had committed to the idea that he was their father in every way that mattered. The responsibility of it was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, the recognition that his choices, his knowledge, his past, were now part of their inheritance. "Show me what you've learned," Marcus said, settling beside the medical bed with the communication pad that displayed the still encrypted transmission. What followed was a revelation that redefined Marcus's understanding of his son's capabilities. Jax walked him through encryption protocols and signal analysis with the competence of someone who had clearly been studying far beyond what Marcus had realized. Together, they decoded the transmission that had been waiting for hours, revealing a message that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Search and recovery operation authorized for target designation, Marcus Kane, formerly Major Earth Defense Corps." Jax read aloud, his young voice stumbling slightly over the military terminology. "Last known position, Nevada 13 Frontier Outpost. Operation classified under Wartime Personnel Recovery Act. Authorization, General Sarah Chen, Earth Defense Command." The name hit like a kinetic round to the chest. Sarah Chen, communications specialist, 23 years old, who had wanted to be a teacher after her service term ended. Sarah Chen, who had died in Marcus's arms during the Proxima Centauri disaster, whose death had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. Sarah Chen, who was apparently alive in command of Earth Defense Command and looking for him. Papa Marcus. Jax's voice carried concern as he registered the shock that must have been visible on Marcus's face. Do you know who General Sarah Chen is? Marcus looked at this boy who had just proven himself capable of analysis and understanding far beyond his years, who had earned the right to honesty through courage and competence and the simple fact that he was family. She's someone who died 3 years ago, Marcus said quietly. Someone I've been carrying the guilt of losing ever since. And if she's alive, if she's in command of Earth Defense Forces, then everything I thought I knew about the Proxima Centauri disaster is wrong. The implications were staggering. If Sarah Chen was alive, what had really happened during that disastrous mission? Who else might have survived? What had Marcus been running from for 3 years, and what did his sudden reappearance mean for the family they had built in isolation? What do we do? Zara asked from the doorway, her voice carrying the steady resolve of someone who had learned to face impossible situations with grace and determination. Marcus looked around the medical bay that had become the heart of their home at the children's drawings, covering the walls, and the improvised improvements that spoke to months of shared living at the 3 people who had become more important to him than his own survival. The kind of scene that transformed space stories into human stories, that reminded audiences why the best science fiction stories and HFY stories were ultimately about the choices that defined what it meant to be human. We figure it out together, he said, echoing Zara's words from earlier, but meaning them in a way that encompassed challenges far beyond atmospheric processor maintenance. As a family. Because that's what we are now, no matter what the outside world wants to call us. Outside, Nevada 13's brief spring continued its uncertain progress toward another brutal winter. But inside the outpost, surrounded by the people who had chosen to build something together despite impossible odds, Marcus Kane prepared to face revelations that might change everything. The kind of audio stories and bedtime stories that reminded listeners that the greatest Reddit stories and short stories weren't about individual heroism, but about the courage to protect what you loved even when the universe conspired to take it away. Sometimes family was proven in moments of crisis, and sometimes those moments revealed that the real test wasn't surviving the crisis, but choosing to remain family when the truth turned out to be more complicated than anyone had imagined. The communication array chimed again, indicating another incoming transmission. But this time, Marcus Kane wasn't facing it alone. He was facing it with his family, and that made all the difference in the universe. 1 year, 365 days since a desperate alien widow had stood at Marcus Kane's door with 2 freezing children and spoken words that would shatter 3 years of carefully constructed isolation. I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father. Now, as Nevada 13's second spring painted the outpost walls with golden light filtering through melted ice, Marcus stood in the same doorway where it all began, watching his family tend the garden that had become the symbol of everything they had built together. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Where once there had been sterile military efficiency, now children's laughter echoed through corridors decorated with Etherean artwork and human technical diagrams side by side. The outpost that had served as a tomb for Marcus's guilt had become a home filled with the particular chaos that only a family could create: toys scattered near heating vents, educational materials spread across every available surface, the lingering scent of Zara's cooking mixing traditional Etherean spices with whatever they could grow in their increasingly sophisticated hydroponic systems. Papa, Marcus. Kira's voice carried the excitement that had become her trademark, a child's enthusiasm that somehow made every ordinary moment feel like an adventure. The earth-root vegetables are ready. Jack says we can make soup that tastes like home. Marcus smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that spread through his chest whenever she called him Papa. The title had evolved from desperate hope to simple fact accepted by all of them without question or qualification. He was their father in every way that mattered. Protector-teacher source of bedtime stories that blended human fairy tales with Etherian mythology. The steady presence who checked for monsters under beds and fixed broken toys with equal seriousness. Which home? He asked, kneeling to examine the vegetables with the mock gravity that children's discoveries deserved. Etherian home or human home? Our home, Jax said from across the garden plot, his voice carrying the quiet wisdom that had characterized his growth over the past year. At 7, he had developed into someone who could troubleshoot atmospheric processors as easily as he could comfort his sister after nightmares. A child who had learned to balance technical competence with emotional intelligence in ways that made Marcus proud beyond measure. The garden itself represented everything they had accomplished together. What had begun as a desperate attempt at sustainability had evolved into something approaching agricultural artistry. Etherian botanical knowledge combined with human engineering had produced crops that shouldn't have been able to survive on Nevada 13's hostile surface. Yet here they were thriving under the care of a family that had learned to make impossible things grow through patience, ingenuity, and love. The communication from General Chen, Zara said quietly, appearing beside him with the particular grace that still took his breath away after all these months. You've decided, Marcus nodded his gaze moving from the garden to the communication array that had become both blessing and burden over the past months. The revelation that Sarah Chen was alive, not just alive but commanding Earth Defense Forces, had forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding for 3 years. What had really happened at Proxima Centauri? Why had he been allowed to believe his entire unit was dead? What did the military want with the Exile who had chosen family over duty? We respond today, Marcus said simply, together, as a family. The decision had taken months to reach, involving countless discussions around the dinner table that served as their informal family council. Democracy had replaced military hierarchy in the Kane household, with even 4-year-old Kira's opinions carrying weight in decisions that affected their collective future. It was the kind of transformation that elevated the best HFY stories beyond mere entertainment into something approaching universal truth. The recognition that strength came not from individual heroism, but from the courage to build something meaningful with the people you chose to love. The message they had crafted was simple, direct, and uncompromising. General Chen, I am alive well and no longer available for military service. I have found something more important than duty, more valuable than redemption, more necessary than whatever mission you believe requires my participation. I have found family. If you wish to understand what happened at Proxima Centauri, I will share what I remember. But I will not leave Nevada 13, and I will not allow anything to threaten the people who have become my life. Marcus Kane, formerly Major Earth Defense Corps. Currently, father, husband, and citizen of a world you've never heard of, but which contains everything that matters to me. You think she'll understand? Zara asked, her amber eyes reflecting the particular concern of someone who had learned to trust their sanctuary but remembered what it felt like to lose everything to forces beyond their control. I think, Marcus said, watching Jax carefully harvest vegetables with the same precision he'd once applied to military operations, that it doesn't matter whether she understands. What matters is that we understand. We know who we are, what we've built, what we're willing to protect. The response came 6 hours later, transmitted on the same encrypted channel that had first brought news of the outside world to their carefully constructed isolation. But instead of official military correspondence, the message was personal, carrying the voice of someone Marcus had thought dead for 3 years. Marcus, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you found something worth living for. What happened at Proxima Centauri, it wasn't your fault. Command made the decision to list the survivors as killed in action, to protect us from war crimes investigations. 37 went and 17 came out. But the political situation required heroes and martyrs, not complicated truths about impossible choices. You carried guilt that was never yours to bear. I won't ask you to come back. I understand now that some wounds heal better in the places we choose, rather than the places that choose us. But know this, you were the best commander I ever served under, and every decision you made saved lives. Your family is lucky to have you, Sarah. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, not the familiar pain of old wounds, but something that felt like release. 3 years of guilt, 3 years of believing he had failed the people who trusted him, 3 years of running from a truth that had never been as simple as he'd imagined. The weight he'd carried across the galaxy, the burden that had driven him to exile on one of the most hostile worlds in known space, suddenly felt lighter than the spring air that carried his children's laughter. Papa Marcus, Kira, appeared beside him, her small hand finding his with the intuitive understanding that children possessed for adult emotional weather. "Are you having the quiet, loud feelings again?" "Different feelings this time, little star," Marcus said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Good feelings, peaceful feelings. The kind that happen when you finally understand something that's been confusing you for a long time. Like when Jax figured out how to make the water recycler stop making the funny noise. Exactly like that," Marcus confirmed and realized it was true. The complexity of war and command decisions and political necessity was no different from any other engineering problem. You gathered information-assessed variables, made the best decisions possible with available resources, and accepted that some problems had no perfect solutions. "Family meeting," Zara announced from the garden, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to manage a household with the same competence she'd once applied to managing trade negotiations across hostile space. Garden harvest celebration and future planning session. What followed was quintessentially them a meal prepared from vegetables. They'd grown themselves served on improvised dishes while sitting on the floor because they'd never bothered to build proper dining furniture, accompanied by conversation that ranged from atmospheric processor maintenance schedules to theoretical mathematics, to whether the earthroot soup really did taste like home. "I've been thinking," Jax said during a pause in the conversation, his young face serious as he considered whatever complex idea had been occupying his analytical mind. "If we're going to stay here permanently, if this is really home forever, shouldn't we make it official?" "Official how?" Zara asked, though her eyes sparkled with the particular amusement that suggested she suspected where this was leading. "Like a ceremony," Kira added, bouncing with excitement at the prospect of anything that involved formal declaration. "Like the bonding ceremonies in Mama's stories, but for whole families instead of just 2 people. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized what his children were suggesting. Not a wedding exactly, but something deeper, a formal acknowledgement of the bonds they had built. The commitments they had made the choice to be family, not because of biology or legal obligation, but because they had decided that loving each other was worth whatever challenges the universe might offer. A family bonding ceremony, Zara said softly, her voice carrying the same wonder that Marcus felt. In all the time we've been together, I never thought to suggest it, because I wasn't sure." "Sure of what?" Marcus asked gently. "Sure that you considered this real," she admitted. "Sure that when you called us family, you meant it the way we meant it." Marcus stood moved by an impulse that had nothing to do with military protocol, and everything to do with the recognition that some moments demanded gestures equal to their emotional weight. He took Zara's hands, looked into those amber eyes that had become the anchor of his emotional world, then turned to include Jax and Kira in his gaze. "I, Marcus Kane, choose you as my family," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Not because I have to, not because circumstances require it, but because loving you has become the most important thing I've ever done. I choose to protect you, to provide for you, to stand with you against whatever challenges come our way. I choose to be your father, your partner, your family, for as long as the universe allows." The ceremony that followed was improvised, heartfelt, and perfect in its imperfection. Vows spoken in 2 languages, promises made to children who had learned that adults could be trusted to keep their word commitments that transformed a military outpost into something approaching sacred space. As Nevada 13's second sunset painted their small world in shades of gold and amber, the Kane family sat together in the garden they had built, surrounded by growing things, and the quiet satisfaction of people who had chosen to create something meaningful from whatever materials the universe had provided. "So, what happens now?" Kira asked, practical, as always, despite her excitement about the ceremony. "Now we live," Marcus said simply. "We grow things. We fix things that break. We take care of each other. We build a life that's worth the love we've put into it." Outside, Nevada 13 remained as hostile as ever, a world that killed the unprepared and challenged even the most careful survivors. But inside their home, surrounded by the people who had chosen to become family, Marcus Kane understood something that the best bedtime stories and audio stories had always known. The greatest science fiction stories and space stories weren't about conquering the universe, but about finding the place and people that made the universe feel like home. Sometimes, forever began not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple recognition that you had already found everything you were looking for. Sometimes, the greatest adventures happened not when you started running, but when you finally stopped running and started living. The communication array chimed softly in the distance, indicating another message from the outside world. But for the first time since its restoration, nobody rushed to answer it. Whatever the universe wanted to tell them could wait. They were busy being family, and that was the most important work in any galaxy. Marcus Kane's journey from broken exile to loving father reminds us that healing doesn't always come from moving forward. Sometimes it comes from finally allowing ourselves to stop running. In our own lives, we all carry wounds that feel too heavy to share, believing we're protecting others by carrying them alone. But this story proves that the greatest transformations happen when we choose connection over isolation, when we let strangers become family, when we discover that home isn't a place we find, it's something we build with people brave enough to love us despite our scars. Welcome to Galactic Sci-Fi Saga, where every story explores what it truly means to be human among the stars. This isn't just science fiction. This is humanity's greatest adventures told through the lens of infinite possibility. Here, humans don't just survive the cosmos. We reshape it through courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds we forge along the way. Each saga we share celebrates the HFY spirit that reminds us why humanity's greatest strength has never been our technology or our weapons. It's our refusal to abandon hope, even when the universe seems determined to break us. If Marcus and Zara's story moved you, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this deserve to find the people who need them most. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, in found families, and the power of love to heal what seems forever broken. And here's the thing, YouTube's algorithm only shows these stories to people when you engage. So drop a comment telling us about your own moment of choosing connection over fear, hit that like button to help this story reach others who need to hear it, and consider supporting us through channel membership to help us create more immersive sagas like this. You're not just subscribers here. You're part of a community that believes in humanity's potential to be better, to do better, to love better. Every week we gather to explore new worlds where the human spirit faces impossible odds and finds ways to triumph, not through force, but through the courage to remain human. So, bookmark this channel as your home for bedtime stories that inspire space sagas that challenge, and HFY adventures that remind you why being human is the greatest adventure of all. The universe is vast and often hostile, but as Marcus Kane learned on Nevada 13, you're never truly lost when you're surrounded by people who choose to call you family. Until our next saga, keep believing in the power of human connection to transform any world into home.